Picture this, you're knee-deep in a gripping mystery game. Someone just disappeared, but you've made a massive breakthrough in your investigation. The threads are starting to connect, the clues are starting to make sense, the stakes are rising. You're excited, and you're about to figure out what happens next, but all of a sudden, you mind control yourself into spending the next 2.5 hours snapping pictures of some weirdos. Now, I'm a big fan of goofy minigames and side content. I find there's a magic in how games deliver side content that's so wild and so crazy that you almost believe it was a mod rather than something in the actual game. And I've tried figuring out what the trick is. What's the secret behind that magic I'm talking about? And I think I've come across a few commonalities and patterns for why some can kind of stick the landing in their goofiness and why some just feel off. I think the ones that work take a premise that's as simple as serious character in a silly situation and take it to the extreme by introducing a gameplay experience that's so different but just as intricate as the gameplay of the main story, so that we get comedy from the irony in the circumstances but also irony in the actual gameplay experience. The other thing is that the side story characters we interact with are given enough life and personality to bounce off the main character's traits and to really push the limits of that irony and circumstance that I was talking about, but without inherently undermining the characterization done by the main story and making us feel like these moments and events are disconnected or out of character. The third and final thing is context. If it's important that what happens in these side stories and minigames aren't out of character, then I think it's just as important that it doesn't become out of place. The premise of these silly side stories and minigames still have to make sense in the setting and the period established by the main story, so that all the goofy things that happen in the side stories really push the boundaries of what is still canonically possible for the main character to do in the environment that they're in. Now, I cannot talk about goofy side content without talking about the Yakuza series. I've pretty much played all the games in the franchise and it's definitely up there in my all-time favorites. And more often than not, I find that the series gets associated with its goofy side stories and minigames than its actual premise as a crime drama. I think one of the big reasons why this is because the side stories and minigames all come with their own distinct and intricately crafted mechanics, and what ends up happening is that when you do stumble upon those side content, you're essentially led down a giant rabbit hole of storylines, gameplay mechanics, controls, and intricacies. For example, in Yakuza 0's real estate minigame, I was recruiting managers and stores into my network and assigning them based on how well they fit different types of property. In Yakuza Kiwami 2's construction minigame, I was basically playing Total War, deploying my units around the field to stop hooligans from disrupting my construction plans. In Yakuza 5's taxi minigame, I was basically playing Need for Speed and street racing delinquents in a totally not stock taxi car. I think letting the side content be its own distinct and fleshed out package is so important because the name of the game here is contrast, and that contrast is working in two different ways here. The first layer is just the very premise of throwing the main character into situations that we would have never expected them to do. This is the irony of the circumstance that I was talking about. To see a reserved and stoic main character suddenly have to do things that are not so reserved and stoic, that contrast you see creates such an awkward scenario that makes you take a step back and think, what is going on? But because the content is so packed with its own fleshed out storylines and vibrant characters, it takes that initial disbelief you had and carries it all the way through, escalating on the irony and contrast that you walk away finding comedy and laughter in all its ridiculousness. The second layer is contrasting the gameplay feel, the irony in gameplay that I was talking about earlier. Games allow for so much interaction and input from the player, so why stop at only letting our characters do unexpected things? Why not make ourselves do unexpected things? And that's where the distinct and intricate gameplay mechanics come into play. They supplement the absurdity of the side content by kind of metagaming you into doing something you didn't expect yourself to do. And because they actually took the time to make these mechanics deep and interesting, that contrast feels more like a fresh experience rather than something gimmicky. It's no surprise then that a very common experience is that you get into these games expecting an action game with high octane combat and badass boss fights, but you walk away being better at racing games, resource management games, RTS games, and even dress-up games. And whether it's in the moment or when you're looking back on the game as a whole, watching yourself do something and be so invested in something so wildly different from what you expected is hilarious. It's funny. That being said, So much of that comedy comes from that initial hit of irony and disbelief. So I think to make sure that the side content continues to be funny and fresh, they have to craft the future content to not feel too familiar, otherwise that familiarity will quickly take away from that sense of novelty that led to the comedy in the first place. And what do I mean by this? Let's take the Pocket Circuit Racing minigame in Yakuza 0 as an example. Kiryu, the main character, competes against little kids in toy car racing and gets visibly upset when his car flies off the track. Silly, but easy to find hilarious, right? The problem is that across the franchise, the minigame gets brought back at least twice, and while it's definitely cool to see him still be interested and passionate about toy car racing, that feeling comes more from a place of nostalgia than silliness or comedy. And so I'm not saying that nostalgia is bad, it definitely has its own set of uses when developing a character, but here I'm strictly talking about reaching that rush of absurdity and comedy from before. By the time we see Pocket Circuit Racing the second time, it's already been baked into his character that he likes it. There's no subversion or contrast or irony going on now, and anyone who's played Pocket Circuit Racing the first time will now be familiar with the mechanics and how to approach it, so there's no subversion of how we expect to play the game there either. It's always nice to have side content that's divided between the ones that are there to evoke nostalgia and the ones that are there to evoke laughter, but the truth of the matter is, they often have to be kept separate, otherwise they fail to achieve either. The other important thing is how the side content delivers characters to supplement the premise of the content, as well as what we know about the main character's personality. A lot of the time, side content can be tedious to get through because the characters you interact with are either really bland or have little to no presence to even justify making them not one-dimensional. This is particularly dangerous in side stories that are meant to be goofy and comedic because it creates this disconnect between the premise and the characters that make it harder to stay engaged and appreciate the silliness of the story. But I think it doesn't stop there, because you can't just have distinct and memorable NPCs. How they interact with us needs to be memorable too. At the end of the day, it's we as the main characters that are engaging with this side story, so it's important that they deliver on the dynamic between us and them. There's a style of Japanese stand-up comedy called manzai, which is basically a double act with a straight man and a funny man. And how it usually goes is they start with a simple premise, but through a rapid exchange of dialogue, gags, and puns, the straight man finally realizes things got misunderstood and out of hand and butts in to correct the funny man's errors. This usually happens by whacking the funny man on the back of his head and calling him an idiot, and that's usually how the joke lands. And kind of going back to what I was saying, when they're able to effectively exaggerate and dramatize these defining characteristics, it's another voice to keep you engaged and glued to the story. They complement the goofy premise because their quirks and traits serve as another angle of comedy on top of the scenario they're already in, and it makes the overall experience more memorable because now your memory of that silly event is tied to your impression of that silly character, and vice versa. I say this because that same dynamic is at play in these side stories. These goofy side stories work so well because they take the premise of serious main character in a silly environment and understand how to execute on this interplay and dynamic between the straight and the funny. It's no surprise then that with how dramatic and exaggerated the personalities of these NPCs are, the way the main character responds feels more sarcastic. For Kiryu, this is to be expected, but even for Ichiban, a noticeably more energetic and dramatic character, he has his moments where he's taking the back seat and kind of being reactive to how silly the NPCs are acting. And this works the same way it works in Manzai because the sarcastic responses highlights the absurdity of the situation, which gives it that hit of irony that elevates the comedy further and makes it more amusing. And I like that they take it a step further by having the main character lean into the silliness a little bit. Sure, their role here is to mainly play the straight man and keep those serious characteristics, right? But that's never stopped them from saying something silly or corny at the very end as some attempt at reflection or introspection. It helps the lighthearted tone of the side story linger right until the very end, and it also helps to humanize and characterize the protagonist because now they're learning something from an experience that's not just some crime, politics, and loss and tragic clashes of ideals. Some people might say that these stories are undermining the characters because they're actively doing something that's goofy and out of character, but I would argue that it's even more out of character for them to not do so. these protagonists have made it their life mission to help others. Their roles in the main story are usually to help those hurt by criminal politics. Their troubled upbringings would suggest to me that they wouldn't say no to helping someone even if their situation was stupid, because they'd rather judge someone to help by the integrity of their character instead of how stupid their circumstances are. What I'm trying to say is, these side stories craft their premises and characters so well that it makes it so easy to deliver their silliness while keeping things within what we deem to be in character, but they also give us unique opportunities to humanize and develop the main character further. The final thing I want to touch on is context. The silliness and goofiness just doesn't hit right for me if it doesn't match the context of the setting and the time period of the entire game. Imagine if we took one of the side stories or mini games in the Yakuza series and put it into a game where the world has been destroyed by war or by some apocalypse. Maybe it'd be cute and lighthearted if they package it well, but even if they do all the things I talked about already, I don't believe it will reach the same levels of absurdity and comedy that I think games like Yakuza and GTA do so well. But more importantly, I think you'd feel that disconnect in context, which would eventually detract and undermine any sense of lightheartedness and comedy that you may feel. Let's take a look at some of the side content in Yakuza and see why even their craziest minigames still fit contextually. What about Yakuza 0's real estate minigame? Well, that makes sense because the game is set during the Japanese asset price bubble. It wouldn't make sense if the game was set after the bubble popped and Japan was in its lost decades period. What about Yakuza 5's taxi racing minigame? Well, Kiryu is canonically working as a taxi driver in that game, so it makes sense why he would be invested in how people behave on the roads. What about Yakuza Like a Dragon's Conquest minigame? Well, that one probably has the craziest gameplay and tonal contrast to the main story, but even that one makes sense because it's framed as a way to make money by collecting trash, which tracks because Ichiban has been stripped of his belongings and thrown into a homeless camp, meaning he has to survive the same way the other homeless people know how to. In theory, this should all be a given. I mean, why wouldn't a game design their content so that it would fit in its setting and the time period that they've crafted? Well, to kind of show why even the craziest minigames in Yakuza games work, I'm going to show you an example that doesn't work. Assassin's Creed Unity, that game takes place during the French Revolution, a period that we now know as a period of political turmoil, strife, and upheaval. But in a game set during such a tumultuous period, it decides to put in a set of missions revolving around running a cafe theater as a base of operations, where you can then upgrade it to give it more features to strengthen your character, but to also make it a zone to watch the NPCs drink and chat and perform music together. It's definitely a neat idea, but it's never quite explained why Arno, the main character, was suddenly given a cafe to run, so the cohesion between side and main content already has a gap that has to be filled in with headcanon. The other problem is that it just doesn't really make sense in the grand scheme of things. Unlike the positive examples I gave in Yakuza, where the minigames made sense to either the characters or the setting, the cafe theater missions don't deliver on either of those things. In a period where people's lives were dominated by insurrections and conflicts, it's hard to find content like this silly and lighthearted because there's just a disconnect between the gameplay and the game world. The other thing is that the main character Arno and what we know about him through the story and his motivations don't match with engaging in goofy and lighthearted things. Much of his development comes from understanding how he creates his own code of justice, and how there's a fine line between following the creed of assassins and being an outright fanatic, but I feel like none of that is really reflected in the cafe theater missions. How is his so-called justice coming into play when managing a cafe? It just doesn't quite strike the same emotions as watching a man that's been stripped of his belongings and playing a minigame that mimics the very real experiences of homeless people. The main takeaway here is that even if you do all the other design elements right, your premise is good, your gameplay systems are unique, your NPCs are well written, if the side content as a whole isn't consistent with the culture of that time period or the events of the game's story and the world, then that disconnect is going to be something that lingers in the back of your mind as you play, and it ultimately will take away from the content's potential as something funny and amusing and lighthearted. At the end of the day, comedy and irony will land differently for different people. What I consider to be hilarious could be the lamest and cringiest thing in the world for someone else. Some people may not even like the idea of goofy side content to begin with, but they simply work for me because they push the limits of what makes sense for my character and the world that I'm interacting with, that I ultimately find comedy in the absurdity of how much they're willing to contrast and flip my expectations. That's going to do it for this video. Let me know what you think. What do you think helps to deliver goofy side content? Do you like the idea of it at all? And what are some of your favorite examples of when it worked and didn't work? Thanks so much for sticking around to the end of the video. I really appreciate you taking the time to watch it, and I'll see you all next time.